All right, so it looks like we are good to go, and I'm not going to say anything about what's been happening in the last week in politics. And obviously, we have a new nominee or a new opening on the Supreme Court. We've got tremendous job growth numbers, including revisions for the last couple of months. And something that I guess I will say a little bit about for just a moment, which is that right, the Republican National Committee meeting in Salt Lake City decided to censure a couple of its own members, and to do so because they were participating on the special investigative committee on the incursion into the Capitol on the 6th of January in 2021. And they called that incursion normal civic discourse, something along those lines. And as you're aware, we're now in our second week of a course on deranged democracy. And I guess one of the symptoms of the fact that things are a little crazy in American politics right now is that a violent incursion into the Capitol that results in multiple deaths and is aimed at disrupting the counting or the registering of the results of an election can be regarded as normal civic discourse by one of the two main parties, right? And so clearly something is going wrong in the balance between the forces of light and darkness in human nature. It appears that the forces of darkness are at least gaining momentum in American politics and democratic politics worldwide in the first couple decades of the 21st century. Today, I want to continue what we began last week, which is looking into the Enlightenment. And the reason to do this, quite simply, is because the constitutions, the ideas, the institutions that structure the modern practice of representative democracy seem to have their roots. I think it's quite clear, have their roots in Enlightenment ideas. And the Enlightenment contains political ideas, but it also contains a bunch of other ideas about the nature, the capacity, the strength of human reason. And in a sense, the democratic institutions that the Enlightenment bequeaths to modernity are rooted in those Enlightenment views of human nature. So getting clear about them will help us then to set our agenda as we transition into 20th and 21st century cognitive science and cognate fields to ask, were the Enlightenment thinkers perhaps overly optimistic or one-sided in their accounts of human nature? And so to kick things off for today, I chose an image from William Blake showing us Newton, and Newton, right, naked, quite buffed, solving a problem using nothing but his mind, and I guess a compass and some paper, right? And so this is a representation of the Enlightenment view of humanity. We don't need the church. We don't need those hierarchical institutions. Give a man the capacity to think for himself and the tools necessary to puzzle out his problems, and he will come to profoundly important insights into the rules governing the universe. And so that's where I want to focus today. Today will be, as was the previous week, more philosophical. And then as I've shared with you, right, we've started out with a general introduction. We're now moving into the details of the philosophy of the Enlightenment, and then we will continue along into the counter-Enlightenment and the question of whether or not the Enlightenment model is too narrow as it was first thought through in 19th century philosophy. And then as those philosophical impulses informed alternative currents of politics in the 20th century in terms of fascism, one of the questions we can ask is whether or not enlightenment and democracy are always shadowed or haunted by counter enlightenment and authoritarianism, whether it's not just an episode of the mid 19th to the mid 20th century, but in fact, a characteristic echo of Enlightenment ideas and institutions. Having done that, we'll then shift into much more contemporary disciplines and sources, looking at cognitive science, at evolutionary understandings of the human brain, at new and modified theories of psychology and psychiatry, in order to ask about the limits and biases of human cognition. We'll then focus for a week on the emotions, and especially the political emotions, as perhaps a source of extra or irrational motivation that may be more powerful, at least when unleashed in our politics, than our rationality. And then finally, having taken this tour, we can conclude by asking whether or not democracy needs to be revised in light of what we've learned about human nature. And if it does need to be revised, what we have learned leads us to support, right? What kinds of institutions or policies or limits on democracy a perhaps more realistic view of human nature lead us to support and endorse. So that's the overview. And I'm going to give a little bit of a reprise of what we talked about last week. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail here, but with this, as with any part of the lecture, please, whenever you have a question, just unmute yourself or raise your hand or put something in the chat bar. I want us to be in conversation whenever there's something you want to discuss. So let us then start with the practical motivations for the course. I've spoken last week about the intellectual motivations for the course. Those will come up intermittently as we cycle through different aspects of the literature. The practical motivations, right, declaring invading the Congress to be a normal exercise of civic discourse, would be a clear example, and it's clearly related to the idea that the election of 2020 was stolen, an idea that is simply concocted without any evidence, and yet has taken hold to such a degree that it's believed by nearly a third of the American populace, 70% of Republicans, and has become the basis for legislation that is attacking core democratic institutions. And it's worthwhile noting that if there's a kind of reservoir of sanity right now in the American political process, it appears to be in the judiciary. You may have seen that the North Carolina and the Ohio Supreme Courts have struck down the highly gerrymandered maps that the Republican-controlled legislatures in those two states drew. And the North Carolina opinion was, I think, especially interesting from the perspective of a kind of post-voting rights world, with the Voting Rights Act having been gutted by the Supreme Court, where now, if anywhere in the American polity, does the idea of political equality, one person, one vote, go to seek redress when parties are turning against democracy. And North Carolina's Supreme Court seems to have indicated a pretty strong commitment to those principles. But having said that, the fact that the court had to intervene reflects the power of disinformation to shape our politics in the third decade of the 21st century. Similarly and relatedly, there's a bunch of self-damaging stuff going on in our polity. And again, I pointed out to you, as far as even a narrow conception of rationality is concerned, doing things that clearly damage your own interest is considered to be a clear hallmark of irrationality. So failing to support policies that would be in your economic interest because you have a kind of tribal commitment to not doing anything that benefits another group that you define yourself as better than, and therefore doing things right that don't benefit yourself. Not supporting poverty relieving legislation is a clear hallmark of American politics in the 21st century. The failure to take the vaccine in the middle of the pandemic, the failure to take action on climate change, and the partisan skewing of opinion on these issues all speak to the degree to which we are not listening to the better argument, not reasoning things through, not following the lead of science, but instead doing other things, paying greater attention to preserving our identity, especially our partisan identities, which now tend to overlap or reinforce many other identities. So again, just review, just explaining where we're coming from, then to get more detailed about where we left off last week. I suggested to you that there is a basic contrast between pre-Enlightenment and Enlightenment worldviews, that the hallmarks, the postulates of the long Middle or Dark Ages of Europe prior to the Enlightenment can be understood as having 5 implicit postulates as kind of organizing thinking about human nature, social order, human knowledge, from the idea that only one person or a small coterie of people have genuine knowledge and insight, and that the vast majority of humanity is simply incapable of governing themselves and therefore must be ruled. The idea that to this day, the Pope, when he's in his full regalia, carries a crosier, a symbolic staff that is meant to represent him as a shepherd, and implicitly, therefore, everyone else as sheep in need of his guidance, is this worldview boiled down to its symbolic essence. The idea, relatedly, that the moral and political order that saves us from anarchy and war is an order that we do not create ourselves, but that is given to us by external sources, that in order to create and preserve that order, most human beings need to be coerced and compelled to do what is morally required of them. The related idea then that we lack intrinsic moral motivation. Turning to the world of ideas, the idea that the universe, our place in it, are things that we need to interpret in light of how they were created metaphysically. I'm just pausing for a second because Bob has asked a question: economic rational interests versus emotional interests. And Bob, do you want to unmute and say a little bit more about what you mean? I could take a stab, but I think I could use a little help.
Basically, when you were talking, you kept on talking about economic interests as if everyone were rational, and that's what that's the only rational thing to be doing is paying attention to your economic benefits. Obviously, or it's obvious to me that what is happening is people's emotional interests are being fostered, and it's taking hold much more than the rational.
And so I want to thank you for the clarification. First of all, say that when we say rational self-interest or reasonable self-interest, and you know, I'm broadening out the terms. I don't mean purely economic interest. And I think, frankly, you know, if you love someone, right, your partner, your child, etc., you have interests that are neither purely focused on yourself nor narrowly economic, right? And so I think that emotional investments entail rational interests as well, right? Seeing your partner, your child's life go well is part of what makes your life go well because of your emotional investment in them. You may not want anyone to suffer, but you're not going to suffer in the same way if somebody who you don't know is suffering, as opposed to if your own child is suffering, right? And so
Can't disagree with that. So
yeah, and so the way I'm using rationality is, I think, a little bit broader than you're indicating when you say economic rationality. And I don't think the contrast with emotion per se captures it, but I understand what you're saying, which is that people are riled up and angry, and that's the basis of their reason for doing things like resisting taking the vaccine in the name of liberty, right? And again, I want to be as clear as possible about this. Martin Luther King Jr., to take an example, had a strong premonition that he wouldn't see his 40th birthday, right? And as it turns out, he was exactly right about that. And yet he continued to lead the civil rights movement at paying the ultimate price in terms of the sacrifice that he made. We don't call him irrational either. We think that he used his moral commitments and his commitment to leading his people in this country in a way that explains why he was ultimately willing to sacrifice his life. And so,
David, what I really wanted to do is you keep talking about economic interests as if that is or should be the entire driver of our activities. And I just don't believe it is. And I believe that other interests are being fostered and brought out by different parties that are causing people to make irrational or decisions
Bob,
contrary to their economic interests.
Bob, I'm trying to agree with you. I'm trying to give examples of the way in which we admire the extended rationality of people who do things that maybe don't follow from their narrow economic interests, whether that's sacrificing for your child or sacrificing for your people or your country or for justice, right? So
okay, I'm happy. So why don't you just continue with the lecture?
Well, but I think it's helpful. So let me just clarify for 10 seconds that there's a difference between doing that and doing something on the basis of bad information that is self-injurious, right? And so when it comes to the failure to take the steps necessary to prevent climate catastrophe, and the reason is that it's a Chinese hoax, or it's not man-made, or there's nothing constructive we can do. Those, I want to say, are in some sense crazy claims. They're crazy because they're not grounded in some higher order moral or emotional interest that trumps your narrow self-interest. They're grounded in bad information and bad reasoning, right? And so that's the difference. That's when I say there's crazy in our politics these days, And I gave the example last week of the incels, the people who seem to think they have the right to have sex with hot, young, blonde, white women, right? And I'm sorry to put it that way, but that's the stuff that's out there on the internet right now. Again, just kind of crazy ideas that seem really to be taking hold to the point where we've got a little political movement that leads a few people a year to pick up guns and go shoot people, right? Again, crazy ideas, not because they're economically irrational, but because they indicate that you've accepted a version of reality that is distantiated from what we know about the world, including the emotional world and the moral world, right? People need to actually be attracted to each other to have sex with each other. You don't have a right to have sex with somebody who doesn't want to have sex with you, right? I'm sorry to go with that example, but that's another way to explain, I think, the broader notion of rationality that I'm trying to use here. Thank you, Bob, and I will move on, but please keep the questions going as they occur. So now back to the contrast between the core ideas that preceded the Enlightenment and the ideas of the Enlightenment. We've talked about the idea that knowledge is esoteric and most human beings are incapable of insight into fundamental truths, that moral order is created not by us, but for us by God, and that we simply have to conform to it, that we have to be coerced into doing the right thing, and that the world as such is a meaningful universe because it was created for us and we have to interpret it. If I wake up and there's an ice storm out my window, I have to ask, what did I do wrong, or who cursed me, or what's wrong in my society such that I'm being visited with this bad weather, not to figure out what's going on meteorologically. And then finally, the idea that history is cyclical and stagnant, and therefore, even when there's a little bit of progress, one should anticipate that very quickly things will revert to the bad tendencies in human nature. That these tenets of a worldview, implicit postulates of a worldview, were deeply challenged to the point where they became hard to sustain by a succession of events that occurred in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries in Europe, by Renaissance humanism, by the discovery that Greek and Roman architecture and art and philosophy and poetry attained a very high standard, despite the fact that they were heathens, and in a way that seemed to show that they were more advanced and perhaps to hold out some sort of prospect for progress, at the same time that the content of the ideas or the art seemed to hold a different view of humanity in which every person is potentially equal to every other person. In addition to that, then the collapse of the hegemony of the Catholic Church in the aftermath of the Reformation, the resulting wars of religion, the sense that it was no longer the case that any singular religious view provided a firm foundation on which to construct knowledge or political authority, that far from it, religion began to look human, all too human, and to be subject to the same kinds of controversies as every other sphere of political activity. And then finally, the scientific revolution suggesting an alternative model of knowledge, right? I showed you the picture of Newton, who doesn't have any sort of regalia, but nevertheless, with his mind and his compass, is solving fundamental issues to do with gravity and momentum. And so an alternative model of knowledge according to which it is open to any and all of us if we will only put our reason to use. And this then, again, being very simplified, but trying to accentuate certain contrasts in the world view that preceded and then the world view that emerged from the Enlightenment, led ultimately to an alternative worldview that had 5 postulates: that fundamental knowledge is accessible to every person if we're just reasonable and conscientious, that social order arises naturally from the typical way that individuals act. And I will speak a little bit later today about Adam Smith and the idea that even our selfishness is potentially beneficial to all of us, would be a good illustration of that point. That we are all internally morally motivated, that we are familiar in our heart, in our conscience, with the tug of the idea of doing the right thing, that we are capable of doing the right thing for the right reason, and that we don't need external threats and sanctions always to get us to do the right thing, even if perhaps we do need them to reinforce what it is that we are already inclined to do, but may be a little bit too weak of will to do consistently and reliably. That the universe is not pregnant with meanings put into it by its creator, but instead is governed by laws. And that the right way to understand the universe is to attempt to formulate those laws through an experimental and hypothetical methodology that gradually allows us to extend the realm of knowledge, and with it the realm of control over nature. One of the books I'm reading, let me see if I can get it without toppling everything else on my desk, is a book by Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now. And one of the things he does is he contrasts an Englishman from 1600 with an Englishman from 1900. And he points out that the Englishman in 1600 believes that there are witches and vampires and werewolves and unicorns, and that they are real threats to him. He doesn't go out at night. Perhaps he goes on unicorn hunts to try to capture that magical beast in order to be able to harness its magic. He believes when he falls ill that it's because somebody has cursed him. And the Enlightenment says, that's magical thinking. That's crazy stuff, because we've never seen a werewolf, a vampire, a unicorn. And by the way, we have much better explanations for why we get ill when we begin to actually plumb the depths of the biology of the human body, right? So an alternative form of knowledge is emerging. And finally, if we harness that knowledge, if we harness every person's capacity for reason and insight, if we allow people to create their own order for themselves based on their internal motivation, we will see progress. And Pinker's book, which I just held up, contains maybe 80 diagrams, all of which try to show, life expectancy might be the easiest one. We're living almost 3 times longer today than we were living in the world governed by these postulates. Right. And the reason we are is because we have made progress in medical science, in sanitation, in nutrition, in agriculture, in public safety. And that is to be expected if you are a adherent of the world view of enlightenment. And to put now, in a sense, the big question of this course in its simplest terms, I assume that none of us wants to go back to the pre-Enlightenment worldview, that has been discredited and is quite unattractive to us. But having said that, do we believe that the Enlightenment view, which I'm presenting as kind of 5 mirror image opposite postulates, is perhaps overblown. That in reacting against the pre-Enlightenment worldview, the adherents, philosophers, politicians, scientists of the Enlightenment went too far, got overconfident, and perhaps the truth is a little bit somewhere in between these two worldviews. So that's where we're going. To get there, I want to start by talking about some details of the Enlightenment, and so I'm going to try to reconstruct what I'm calling a philosophical discourse or dialectic of enlightenment. And to be clear in saying that, what I hope I will be able to share with you is, on the one hand, the idea that there are really diverse views among thinkers that we group together as Enlightenment thinkers. And that, on the other hand, that diversity is not haphazard. There's a reaction that occurs as Hobbes reacts to Descartes, Locke reacts to Hobbes, Hume and Smith build on but differentiate themselves from Locke, and ultimately Kant builds his system on the basis of his understanding of the limits and the needs for repair from all of those previous thinkers. And so I'm obviously not going to be able to give you a detailed introduction to Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Smith, and Kant today, but I do hope to walk you through, in a sense, this passing of the baton across generation of Enlightenment thinkers to give you at least a sense of where these ideas came from. And so let's start with Descartes and Hobbes. And these are really 17th century thinkers. And you can see there's actually some overlap between them. Hobbes lives almost twice as long as Descartes, and Descartes has his philosophical contributions earlier in his life. So I'm going to start with Descartes, and he's French, although he spends much of his life in the Netherlands as a mercenary, actually. And so he wanted to distinguish himself militarily, but he was not born into the right caste to do that in France. And so he went to the Netherlands, and he therefore is a Catholic. I should say therefore, he's a devout Catholic. He remains deeply religious throughout his life, but he's living among Protestants, and he's come of age during the French Wars of Religion. And these are brutal, awful wars. And so he certainly has some sense of the anarchy being unleashed in his world by the forces of religious conflict. He is clearly a man of science, and he's the founder of analytic geometry. And I just want to say for a moment, right, analytic geometry is just what we call geometry today, but it's a way of doing geometry that allows us to connect it to algebra. It's the precursor to calculus, which another philosopher come mathematician, Spinoza, builds on the basis of the work that Descartes did. And part of the reason Descartes is able to make these radical breakthroughs in mathematics is because he's using Arabic mathematical notation. And so the story I'm telling focuses exclusively on Europe, but I want to be careful in noting that Europe in many ways is being influenced by extra-European cultures, ideas, etc., as is clearly the case. Try doing analytic geometry with Roman numerals. You're not going to get very far. It's because of a superior numerical notation system that modern math gets going in Europe, a system that Europeans did not themselves invent. So where I want to focus with Descartes is the credit that he's given for being really the first modern philosopher. And if you take a kind of introduction to philosophy course in many universities today, you might go very quickly from Plato to Aristotle to Descartes. And in so doing, you might just notice that you're skipping almost a couple thousand years. And part of the reason that you're skipping those couple thousand years, sometimes we do a little bit of work in between. We might do a little Augustine and Aquinas, but really the idea of epistemology, how do we know what we know, is revived and placed front and center in Descartes' meditations. And this is what he resurrects from ancient philosophy and bequeaths to modern philosophy, the reason we kind of view him as the pivot into modern philosophy. And he turns in particular to method. He writes a discourse on method, to the idea that methodical thought can solve many of the problems of epistemology. Now, you say the name Descartes, and most people will associate him immediately with cogito ergo sum, the idea that I think, therefore I am, his probably single most famous declaration. And I need to give a little bit of context to how he came up with that. And in certain respects, the Matrix movies, I don't know if you guys have seen or not, but they build on Cartesian radical doubt and skepticism. And Descartes raised this question: how do I know that what I see, what appears to me through my senses, is what there really is out there in the world, as opposed to perhaps having been imprisoned by some evil demon who has the capacity to systematically delude me about what I'm seeing. So I'm not actually in the world, I'm in the demon's dungeon, and he's just manipulating me to make me believe that I'm talking with you over Zoom right now. This idea then Descartes takes very seriously and suggests, and I'll put it in slightly more contemporary language, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, we interpret as being the world around us. But in fact, it is all activity up here in the brain, right? It's the brain's representation of what our senses impart to us about the world. How do we know that it actually corresponds to what's going on in the world when all we have is our senses, right? If our senses are deluded, then we cannot figure that out. And Descartes' solution to this problem is the cogito, is the thing that he thinks he can be absolutely certain of, is that he's thinking, right? How else could he even begin to formulate the proposition of radical doubt? And that means that he has thought, that he has reason, that there's something going on in his brain. And the question that he poses on the basis of that conclusion is, how did I come to have the capacity for thought? And his answer to that, his ultimate answer to that, is it must have been imparted in me in God, by God, right? You know, it's impossible to account for the capacity to think in any other way. We are created beings, and so we have been created with thought. And by the way, if God imparted us with reason, God, unlike that demon who might have trapped us in his dungeon, is good. And so God would not have equipped us with the faculty that allows us to be systematically deceived. And so we are able ultimately, not because of our senses, but because of our methodical effort to turn reason in upon itself, to be confident that the deliverance of our senses is in fact reliable. Now, I went really quick. There's a lot more detail, but I hope you can see in a sense why many of Descartes' contemporaries were in a sense more impressed by the way in which he used doubt and method than the way in which he supported his conclusions. And again, that's what makes him an Enlightenment thinker. What makes him the first modern philosopher is his focus on the problem of knowledge, his use of turning reason in upon itself, and methodical thought. His contemporary, Thomas Hobbes, English, actually acquainted with Descartes. They corresponded back and forth with each other. Hobbes learned a lot from Descartes, but he ultimately came to the conclusion that the Cartesian solution to the riddle of radical doubt did not work. Hobbes came of age during the English Civil War. He was actually very much caught up with it. He worked for his entire life a royalist family, a family that supported the king. The English Civil War of the 1640s and 1650s attacked the monarchy, ultimately beheaded the king. By the way, if you believe in the divine right of monarchs, that the king is appointed by God, it's a little hard to explain why God would allow the king to have his head chopped off by commoners, right? And so another dent to the confidence of the medieval religious worldview. Hobbes was a tremendously fearful man, and he was working for a royalist family. He was forced to flee England to France, living in Paris at the time that the king was beheaded, and came to the conclusion that it was more important that Britain put warfare behind it than that his side win. And so in 1651, Thomas Hobbes wrote in a big hurry the Leviathan, the greatest work, philosophical work in the English language, written in about 6 months, but consolidating a lifetime's worth of philosophical inquiry, and published it to try to convince the royalists to support Cromwell and the new regime. Didn't do very well in that regard, but nevertheless, one of the truly great modern philosophical works. I would point out we don't exactly know how religious Hobbes was. What seems absolutely clear is that if he was at all religious, his religious was of a heterodox or unconventional character. He was on multiple occasions in his life threatened with being prosecuted for heresy. In 17th century England, to be called a Hobbist was just equivalent to being called a heretic. And so he was, in a quite devout country, a religious skeptic of one variety or another. Hobbes was a brilliant humanist. He was a wonderful stylist in English and Latin, and pretty good in Greek too, and knew basically almost every modern European language. And yet he became convinced that the project of humanism, just making beautiful things in language and in so doing humanizing our souls and psyches, was not succeeding, right? There was still civil war all around him, religious warfare in many places in Europe. And so he was ultimately a brilliant humanist, but someone who rejected humanism. And at the same time, he ultimately concluded that Descartes' whole philosophical system rested on a very thin theological reed that was too flimsy to support the weight it carried. And in particular, Hobbes just was unwilling to accept that the fact of a good God could rescue us from skepticism. And as Hobbes pointed out in what's probably the first genuinely sociological study of religion, what we know about God is as limited as what we know about everything else. It's mediated by human language and human texts and human institutions. God did not come down and tell you or me what he thinks. If he told his prophets, if he told Moses or Christ or Muhammad what he thinks, well, that was centuries or millennia ago. And we don't have access to it anymore. All we have is what some people who maybe were contemporaries or maybe we now know came centuries after wrote down, trying to create a new system of belief. And then that's been passed down by institutions, churches that have their own dynamics, their own politics. We cannot rely on theology to rescue us from skepticism. And I've put on the slide here a painting from Rene Magritte that I think captures very nicely the limits of the senses in the way in which Hobbes understood it. And so if you look at that painting, it has an easel in the middle of it, right? And the canvas is on that easel, and the canvas represents exactly what's out the window, right? And if you don't look at it carefully, you're inclined to confuse what's on the canvas for what's out the window. And then if you think about it for a second, you say, wait a sec, the whole thing is a canvas. There's a canvas within a canvas. And then you begin, I hope, to get what Marguerite is trying to say to you, which is that we tend to confuse our representation of things for the things themselves. But just as he painted, this is not a pipe, a painting of a pipe that looks just like a pipe, but please don't confuse a painting of a pipe for a pipe. He is pointing out to us our tendency to confuse our representation of the thing for the thing. And this is what Hobbes fundamentally took from Descartes. All we have is our senses, and our senses only give us representations of reality, not reality itself. And by the way, it tends to be pretty unreliable. Look around your room right now, which presumably is well lit, and notice the color on the walls and other objects in the room. And then imagine yourself in that same room with the lights turned off at nighttime. Would you see any of that color? Has anything actually changed about that room? Or is it just that your eyes see one thing when there's a lot of light and another thing when there's not a lot of light? And that's just one example of the many that Hobbes could give us of the way in which our senses often seem to alter the appearance of reality when there's been no genuine alteration of the reality. So our senses are unreliable, but that's all we've got. We've got no other way of understanding the world. We can't ask God for a rescue line to pull us out of the doubt. And so Hobbes suggests that what we need to do in these circumstances in which we can never be terribly confident about our understanding of the world, is rely instead on a minimum notion of human rationality. And in this regard, Hobbes suggests that for a long time, philosophy has been asking the wrong question. What is best in life? What is the ultimate human good? Those questions don't admit of singular answers. Why we see Europe tearing itself apart is because they admit of multiple answers. What is the worst thing in human life? That Hobbes suggested we can all agree on, and it's death. Because when you die, no matter what else you enjoy in life, you are incapable of enjoying it, right? And so we can all agree whatever we value, we've got to be alive in order to be able to enjoy it. And not only that, but the constant fear of death undermines our capacity to do anything else that we enjoy. We're going to spend all our time trying to preserve and protect ourselves. And so let's focus on a narrow core account of human rationality, and then notice that our senses are unreliable and it's all we've got. Then how can we get out of a situation in which we're not going to agree on anything? And Hobbes suggests that the way out is through authority. We need a government powerful enough to force us all to agree, to be peaceable, to get along with each other. But the only way to get such a government powerful enough to control us is if each of us cooperates with that government, lends it our power. And that doesn't mean literally each and every one of us has to be a policeman, but each of us has to recognize at least the obligation to comply with what the sovereign tells us to do. And that means each of us have to consent in the construction of a singular and strong sovereign. And hence, among Hobbes' central innovations is making almost irresistible for subsequent philosophers the metaphor of the social contract. Each of us has to consent to the government that we occupy. And that is then how we get a strong sovereign. So unless there are questions, I'm going to keep going for another few minutes and take you further through this dialectic of enlightenment, and now look at John Locke, who is, again, roughly a contemporary of Hobbes. He's a generation later in terms of when he's born. He lives about a dozen years longer than a dozen years after Hobbes' death. And Locke, it's a interesting story. He's actually training as a physician at Oxford University. He becomes a member of the faculty there. A rich member of the aristocracy comes there with liver problems, and Locke in the 1650s operates on this man and installs actually a tube to allow his liver to drain the bile. And believe it or not, the man lives. And not only that, is so impressed with Locke, he hires Locke and lives another 20 years with Locke's device installed. The man is one of the leaders of a faction in Parliament. And this faction, in a controversy that breaks out in the 1670s, is in particular the leader of the group that is in favor of excluding the king's brother from inheriting the throne. The king has no male children, and so according to the rules of inheritance, it should go to the brother, but the brother is Catholic, and of course, England is a Protestant society, and the result is the so-called exclusionary crisis. Can Parliament legitimately exclude the next heir to the throne? It results in the Glorious Revolution and ultimately William and Mary coming from the Netherlands and taking over the British throne. This is important because Locke is pulled into this on the side of those who maintain the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy. I'll say more about this a little bit later, but the basic idea here is that because Parliament is accountable to the people, regularly elected or reappointed, whereas the monarch is a lifetime hereditary position, it's only Parliament that secures the consent of the people. and therefore the parliament has to be ultimately sovereign, and that sovereignty extends to its ability to exclude the king, right? Exclude the next heir if they don't consent to him taking over that powerful position. Now, that's Locke's political philosophy. I'll say more about it in a moment, as expressed in the two treatises on government that were published anonymously in 1688 in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, but written almost a decade before that, and written and published anonymously because Locke recognized that his discovery as the author of these texts put him in mortal peril. So even in private letters to his own relatives, he refused to acknowledge that he was the author of what has become perhaps his most famous and influential work. But the work that he was best known for in his lifetime was published in 1689, the Essay on Human Understanding, a major treatise that was written over more than 20 years. As a result, sometimes feels a little incoherent, as if its author has changed its mind, but that became, upon its publication, perhaps the most famous defense of the philosophical point of view that came to be known as the Enlightenment. And Locke takes over from Hobbes the idea that the only source of knowledge is our senses. This is what's called empiricism, right? That all of our knowledge is empirical. As Locke famously says, our minds are tabula rasa, blank slates, until the senses begin to give them the content that ultimately becomes our knowledge. And that it is true that the senses are sometimes deceived, that a well-illuminated room looks different from a dark room. But please note that that's not entirely true. The shape and place, the volume, the size of objects is not altered, even though the color is. And so Locke distinguishes between primary qualities that seem to be invariant and secondary qualities about which our senses can be deceived, and suggests that this is the beginning of a more fine-grained effort to turn reason again in upon itself, and to begin to introduce distinctions that help us to see how our reason works and when it works well. If you're looking at your room and you see that it has a certain number of walls, maybe some pillars, and that those things don't change, you can begin to formulate some ideas. Those walls and pillars are there. They don't depend on my senses per se. And not only that, you can then begin to formulate some further ideas. The walls and pillars probably hold up the roof and the rest of the building. And the ratio of pillar to weight it supports, the distance between the walls, I can begin to calculate and formulate a hypothesis that a structure that has its walls this far apart will be stable, but a structure that has its walls this far apart will not be stable unless it has these number of pillars in it. And then I can test that hypothesis. And in that way, I can use my limited sensory apparatus that only gives me access to my mental representations of the world to figure out what actually works in the world, right? And so there is a philosophical foundation, an epistemological foundation for what science is doing. It's not just getting lucky or deluded. We can defend the scientific method using the tools of philosophical argument. Locke also defends the idea that when we turn reason in upon itself, when we reflect about what we know, we recognize that we also know certain laws about how to treat other human beings, that it's wrong to kill them, that it's wrong to injure them, it's wrong to steal from them, and that in fact we have a duty to aid them when we can do so when they're in jeopardy and it poses no real danger or cost to us. All of that we can see just by looking at the fact that we are all equal and that we are all made by a creator, and therefore we have a certain value, a certain dignity that requires respect. Hence, don't enslave, don't kill, don't steal from or to each other. And that as a result, human reason can produce an ordered society even without government. And hence, yes, Mr. Hobbes, we should have a social contract, but we can't delegate to the sovereign powers we don't ourselves possess. And we don't possess absolute authority over each other, so we can't give government absolute authority over us. And instead, what we want from government is to clarify the natural law, to promulgate it so that everybody can see what it contains, to enforce it so I don't have to enforce it myself, to adjudicate when there are disputes, to execute the law. But that's all we want our government to do. And the government needs to be accountable to us to make sure that it's actually doing what we have delegated to it. And so please note that Locke has started in many respects on Hobbes' premises, both about the nature of the limits of human knowledge and about the need for consent in a situation where people may not agree in their religions or worldviews or what their highest goods are, but gotten to a place where we can be confident about science and appoint, if you will, something resembling a democratic government. And so that's to give you a sense of the way in which this discourse is unfolding. I know I went a little over time. I know I'm being very philosophical. I'm curious what you're thinking about these lectures, both whether you have questions, but also whether you're enjoying the tour of Enlightenment philosophy. I kind of hope so, but let me know what you think, please. Anybody want to start us out? It's different from what I normally do with you, so that's why I'm curious about how you're receiving it.
Well, David, this is Bob.
Hi, Bob. Again.
It's a little deep for me, I must admit.
Oh, Bob, you remuted yourself, or was that all you had to say?
No, that's not all.
Okay.
I did have something to sort of bring up and quibble with. Hume says that we can't, everything we know and do and et cetera, comes via our senses, right?
Hobbes, yes.
Hobbes, okay, I'm sorry. I did say Hobbes, okay. What about DNA? We do not experience DNA through our senses. However, it certainly affects us in many, many ways. You know, I don't need to enumerate them, I don't think, but it's not a sense, and yet it has profound effect on our lives.
Yeah, so obviously there are all kinds of things that we don't perceive directly, but that we nevertheless believe we have an understanding of, right? And I want to take your example for a moment. First, obviously, Hobbes writes a few hundred years before the discovery of DNA. And so he's not obviously thinking of that example, but Hobbes is actually active, and part of the reason he was writing to Descartes, in the field of optics. among his jobs is he's working on ballistics, and being able to create a telescope to see where your cannonballs go is very helpful for calculating how to aim your cannons. And so he's familiar with the idea that there are things that are microscopic, right? That we can't see, but nevertheless are important. So the idea that there may be things that we can't directly perceive, but that we will come to have an understanding of, is an idea that Hobbes is familiar with. And by the way, Hobbes has all sorts of theories about how the optic nerve works, or what we would call the optic nerve. He doesn't really know that there is an optic nerve, but he is curious about how light penetrates the eye and then creates sensation in the brain. But having said all of that, how do we know what DNA is? Right? I mean, at some point, it's because, right, we got microscopes powerful enough to look at the genetic material that gives us the blueprint for our bodies. And having said that, obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. But again, the claim here would be that all of this is ultimately dependent upon our sensation. If we didn't see DNA under a microscope, we would be pretty limited in our capacity to theorize or understand how it works. Now, having said all of that, Bob, I'm not defending Hobbes. I'm giving you a history of ideas, right? And so I've just told you that Locke says the human brain is tabula rasa. And by the way, that's probably just a way of representing what Hobbes thought also, right? That everything comes from our senses. And we now know that that doesn't appear to be true, right? That there is a cognitive structure or architecture to the human brain that allows us to understand certain things very well, because that's the way the brain is structured. And by the way, speaking of DNA, it's because we evolved to be able to undertake certain cognitive processes, because there were clear evolutionary advantages to being able to see certain things, smell certain things, hear certain things, use language, etc. Right? So all of that, it appears, is not simply inscribed in the blank slate of the brain by the senses, but already there in the brain. So yes, if your claim is Hobbes is not correct about everything, or Locke is not correct about everything, or Descartes is not correct about everything, absolutely. The reason for the tour of the history of philosophy is not because they're right, although there are aspects of their ideas that I think still inform contemporary philosophy, and via philosophy, contemporary culture and institutions. But the reason for the tour is because it's impossible to understand why Thomas Jefferson penned, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain rights." That there's a straight line, maybe it's a zigzag line, from Descartes and Hobbes and Locke to the institutions that still structure our political lives today. And understanding the philosophical presuppositions of our politics is helpful in understanding maybe why our politics are disappointing in the 21st century. That's the overall reason for doing this. Is that making sense, Bob?
It is very much so. Thank you.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, especially if you're encountering these ideas for the first time and you're philosophically curious, it is natural to note, wait a sec, he said that, that's crazy. Or he said that seems to have all these other implications. That's, for my mind, part of the excitement of doing philosophy. Anybody else? And look, I'm looking for feedback in addition to questions and comments. Is this making sense? And is this a good use of our time together on Saturday mornings? Deafening silence. Okay, Barbara is nodding, thank you. And anybody else? And I'm happy to hear, you know, that you're going too fast or too deep, and this is not making sense. All right, Elizabeth, go ahead.
I would like to point out that I don't know how you spent time in Berkeley without encountering any witches, but we got them here.
Yes.
I know several people who consider themselves to be witches.
Yes, and on the other hand, most of us, when we get sick, don't go to them or blame them, right? But yes, I am.
What about the astrologers? You know, this stuff is alive and well.
Oh my goodness, I'm surrounded by people who believe in astrology. No offense, but it's not me. When I meet someone, I'm interested in knowing them as an individual, not knowing their zodiac sign. Anybody else? And thank you, Elizabeth, for pointing that out.
Well, David, in terms of feedback, I certainly find this stuff enlightening. Although difficult. I think I will actually view this lecture a second time in order to try and take it all in.
All right. Well, I'm glad
continue
you
on.
have the opportunity to do that. And Jeanette, do you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this, and it's interesting because I've just recently started like going back to things that I know I had in college, but I don't remember, and and I'm sort of the feeling I didn't know enough then to know how this related to other things. And so yes, I did study Locke and Hobbes, but I couldn't have told you anything about it. So I'm glad to do this and to see how it relates to things that are going on today.
There's a quip from Oscar Wilde, which I've probably shared with you before, which is that youth is wasted on the young. And I often think, you know, that especially education is something that should be lifelong, as opposed to merely concentrated in the first 20 odd years of life. And so yes. And I've got another comment from Dorothy saying, and I guess what I'm gathering is nobody is saying this isn't working. And so I'm gonna continue along this path unless and until you say too much philosophy, get back to politics. That's what we want you for. Okay. All right.
Continue,
everybody.
please, David. Thank you.
Oh, of course, Jonathan. Thank you. Good being with you as always. I'm hopeful that what Amy said comes to pass quickly, and that you're out and about and enjoying everything that Piedmont Gardens has to offer in the near future. Take care and see you next week. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.